my presentation is mostly to talk a little bit more about the variations and differences between trafficking and smuggling. I mean, these two terminologies have been used quite a bit in the last 10 to 15 years. But to begin with, this is what we oftentimes hear, the dominant narratives. These are the narratives that often get propagated through the media, especially the news media. On the smuggling side, human smugglers are considered a major enabler and contributor to transnational migration, and without whom most won't enter the migration stream. And by the way, EU, we just came back from Europe, the EU just invested a whole bunch of money, 30-some million euros, and to commission Interpol and European Council to study the human smuggling, transnational human smugglings around the Mediterranean regions. So the policy or the investment of the money suggested that the human smuggling, transnational human smugglers, are the main cause for the irregular migrations from the Mediterranean and into the European southern front. And the human smugglers are often portrayed as evil predators, setting up traps along migration routes and baiting naive and desperate migrants. And also, migrants are considered or oftentimes portrayed as these vulnerable and helpless victims and entirely at the mercy of their handlers or smugglers. And therefore, the key to combating illegal migration is really to go after these human smugglers and get rid of them, arrest them, put them in jails, and that will solve the transnational irregular migration problem. Okay, on the trafficking side, human traffickers are evil predators, often portrayed, yes, and preying upon enslaving women, children using special techniques. And the worst kind of trafficking involves sex trafficking and exploitation. In other words, the exploitations of young women and children from third world countries. The women are especially being sex trafficked and are emotionally forcefully controlled by their pimps. And therefore, key to eradicate modern slavery or the human trafficking problem is to catch and eliminate these traffickers. So in other words, on both sides of this of the issues, the main enablers or the main perpetrators of these two social phenomena are either the coyotes or the human traffickers. That's largely the main narrative that you will get from the news reports and the media coverage, and also including quite a few of the government reports. So what is trafficking? We talked to some extent in the last presentation. There are really no common and unified definition. Really, when people have definitions and decide to describe what the problem is, you often need to pause and think, really, if that's the definition, that's probably more too simplistic. There are no common and unified definition. Now, later we can talk, there are legal frameworks that legislators constructed to provide a context to enable law enforcement agencies to respond, to plan out frontline strategies. And some nations' legal system, legal system do not even recognize this as an offense. In other words, there's no legal framework. Although an increasing number of countries, at least member states of the UN, have various versions of the anti-trafficking and anti-smuggling framework. And the word trafficking can mean different things to different people, different agencies and organizations, and really oftentimes reflect the orientation or policy agenda of those agencies and organizations. And also human smuggling and human trafficking are often used interchangeably and erroneously. Although the effort was made back in 2000 to try to separate these two terms, especially with the passing of the UN Convention or the Palermo Convention, try to separate these two terminologies. But for a very long time, following that convention, which is supposed to dictate how all nations are supposed to describe these two separate phenomena. Many years following that convention, even U.S. federal agencies still confuse these two through their operationalization of the terminologies in their counting of the victims, confusing victims from smuggling with the trafficking and therefore causes some administrative confusions over what are really the numbers. There are three main legal frameworks that govern the trafficking issue. One is the UN Convention Palermo. It was passed in Palermo, Italy, and essentially described trafficking of human beings through force and fraud. That's what I keep telling people, the two essential elements that define trafficking. One is fraud, the other is force. So if you have the two apps, can clearly identify them, then you have a trafficking situation. And these the fraud and force are used to extract labor in some forms, either manual or sexual labor, to achieve some monetary gains. So the end game is still commercial interests. And then you have the US TVPA, was passed also 2000, and has two separate definitions for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Although currently the movement seems like at least the advocacy groups are moving to overlap these two, essentially calling human trafficking as just a form of extraction of human labor, whether it's sexual or manual or physical, under unfavorable or coercive conditions. Then ILO, of course, for the interest of the labor persuasion, has established a definition of forced labor back in the 1930s, and it has changed very little, but the essential elements are still there, and essentially defines any time if you extract human labor under the menace of a penalty, and for which the person has not offered voluntarily, is considered forced labor. Okay, sex trafficking and labor trafficking under US TVPA are kept separately. One, of course, involves sex, and the other was with labor. And you will be surprised to know that much of the conversations about human trafficking has largely falls on the sexual persuasion. Essential sex trafficking, I'm sure you all understand the legal frameworks, involves extractions of the sexual services under force and fraud, and then when it applies to juveniles under the age of 18, anytime you subject juveniles to sexual services is considered human trafficking. Labor, again, is the same, harboring, transporting, and obtaining labor from another person through the force and fraud. Again, the two issues constantly referred as force and fraud. Okay, so what does that mean to research and practice? I mean, we have the legal framework, but how do we actually put that into practice? There are very, very few reliable estimates on the scope and scale of labor trafficking or sex trafficking, for that matter. But there are plenty numbers flying around, and of course, stories. You have all kinds of stories. With very little, one of the gentlemen asked about the data sources. Oftentimes you hear all these sensational stories and also sensational numbers and describing the severity of the problem, but with very little supporting documents to verify how these numbers came about. And of course, you have this lopsided emphasis on sex trafficking. But in general, most of these situations are caused by people who want to move from one location to another, and along the way being exploited, abused in some forms or fashion. And largely, this is the issues of whether the possibility of improved human security or prosperity can be realized through individual behavior. How would you describe these individuals through the lens of these individuals? And that's some of the questions that we looked at quite a bit in recent years. So what do we know about irregular migration or as well as human trafficking? The decision to move, to uproot from one's familiar social settings to go to a place that's entirely new and foreign really takes a lot of considerations. And people don't just uproot themselves and start moving to a new location. There are usually some compelling reasons. I mean, some are compelling, of course, others relatively mundane, for instance, for a better economic future. And others are quite compelling, for instance, wars and religious persecutions and civil unrest, which just makes it impossible for you to have a reliable, stable living condition. There are multiple causes, especially when families are thrusted into the irregular migration routes. For family to move, especially now you look at the refugee crisis from Syria and Libya, and you would know what are the conditions that these families must have gone through in order for the whole clan, for the familial network to thrust themselves into the migrational routes to an environment that's totally foreign and new to them. Of course, through these circumstances, when people are thrusted into unfamiliar or even hostile environments, they are certainly expose themselves to a lot more possibilities of being abused and exploited. And what we consider is that the labor-related incidents probably are far more prevalent than the sexual exploitation. And we suspect that these instances involving labor abuses are widespread and especially affecting the irregular migrants. And no country now in the world is exempt from human trafficking or smuggling, whether you're a source country or you're a destination country or you're a transit country somewhere. So you notice that there's a significant movement of the populations. And some countries turns into destination country, others are source countries, and then along the way you have all these transit countries. Okay, so with the rest of the time, I want to share with you one of the studies I did in San Diego on labor trafficking. So this is, we use a special technique, some of you are interested in the research methodology. We use a special technique to look at undocumented migrants and their experiences with the labor market. Any questions up to this point? No, all relatively general. So let me go to next. All right, so I hope I have time to go through all these. Okay, so at the time when I started this project, my argument was that, of all the stories you heard in the media and government reports, human trafficking, when we talk about human trafficking, we're mostly talking about sex trafficking. So if you follow the media, if you follow the government reports, follow the billboards, if you travel, anytime you travel in Europe or some parts of the U.S., you see the billboards and not for sale, you have the girls' pictures there, and Hollywood movies, of course. And most attention, political as well as financial, is geared towards sex trafficking, and more specifically, CSAC issues.
What is CSAC?
Of the commercial exploitation, sexual exploitation of children. So just kids. A case in point, 2 years ago in California, we passed a proposition, Prop 35, as human trafficking, anti-human trafficking proposition. It listed a long list of stipulations and essentially increasing the penalty for convicted sex traffickers, they call it human traffickers, across the board. Convicted traffickers now face prison sentences of 12 years, and more than double the previous penalty, and a possible life sentence when children are involved. And penalties increase from $100,000 to $1.5 million. And there's an expanded definition to include distribution of child pornography into the human trafficking legislation now. And traffickers now are required to register as sex offenders. And that proposition received wide bipartisan support, 81%. When was the last time you see any legislation or election results that are resulting in 81% of approval of anything? This really received wide bipartisan support in California. And throughout the entire legislation, the legal languages, labor was not mentioned once. So in other words, this thing, although it's called anti-human trafficking legislation, was really about anti-sex trafficking, not about just overall human trafficking. So my argument is, how could this be? If we're talking about human trafficking, if you're talking about human trafficking and as a process of extracting human labor, whether it's a sexual or physical, from individuals under some unfavorable conditions, either through force or fraud. And imagine human trafficking as a totality. Imagine human labor as a totality. Hospitality, restaurant business, construction, landscaping, agriculture, domestic service, childcare, you name it. The whole gamut of human labor activities where labor could be extracted under unfavorable conditions. How much of that has to do with sex? If you're talking about human trafficking as a totality. Of all the forms of labor you could extract for commercial purposes, for profits, monetary gains, how much of that will have to do with sex? So in other words, what I'm arguing is the disproportionate attention given to sex trafficking totally overshadows the human trafficking issue. If we still want to talk about human trafficking as involving both labor and sex. So my argument is that the disproportionate sex trafficking discussion makes no logical sense to me. And this, of course, I'm here to say that this is not to deny the existence of sex trafficking or downplay its significance. It is not. I mean, this is not the intent of this. But this is almost like talking the federal budget deficits, focusing on the Air Force One, focusing on the largesse and pork barrels and all the politicians could bring home, and ignoring the other 98% of the issues that cause the federal deficit. So, in other words, we're really ignoring the majority of the human trafficking issue and zeroing in on the sex trafficking for obvious reasons. It's sensational, it's sexy, it grabs people's attention anytime you talk about sex. And in the last 5 or 6 years or so, researchers from around the world, including the U.S., especially in ILO for obvious reasons, and the International Labor Organization, and the UN, to start questioning such lopsided, disproportionate attention towards sex trafficking. And the 3 legal frameworks I'm going to quickly go through. And here's an extra layers of complexity in this issue. Under the U.S. Code, human trafficking is under 7102. However, we do have another clause under the U.S. Code 1589. It's about forced labor. It lays out the definitions of what constitutes a forced labor. And there's a quite overlap between the two, with the only one exception, fraud. Under 1589, fraud or deception was not considered a qualifying element. Whereas in 7102, U.S. Code 7102, fraud or force both could become qualifying elements to define the crime. The challenges in defining human trafficking. We talked about the conceptual ambiguities between the two. But when you actually translate human trafficking into specific questions, for researchers, especially empirical researchers like us, if you want to do quantitative research, we're confronted with the challenge of having to translate whatever legal frameworks you work under into specific questions. We have to ask people specific questions so it eventually could be extracted and generalized into the larger framework. And we talked about the glaring absence of a fraud and deception in U.S. Code 1589. And by the way, for those of you in the law enforcement agency, currently labor trafficking as it is being practiced, operationalized by either prosecutors or law firms or attorneys who filing T visas, largely comply with the 1589, not the 7102, not the human trafficking legislation. In other words, currently, I challenge anyone to find a human trafficking case entirely stands on fraud or deception elements. You almost always need to have a coercive element, force element in there to qualify for any forms of a consideration by the prosecutors or law firms or attorneys who are filing the T visa or U visa applications on your behalf. So in practice, much of our operationalized version in the trenches is really aligned with the U.S. Code 1589, not the general human trafficking legislation. Okay, then there's a temporal sequence where the incident occurred. When does it happen? As we all know, the human trafficking or human smuggling, it's really a continuum of events, activities involving multiple stages. So where do you want to define that, or does one incident qualify the entire sequence of events, or do you look at the all and to minimize any single stages during that process? And for trafficking violations, do you need one-time exposure or versus repeated exposure? For all of you who are in the law enforcement, we know that crime is always defined as an incident. It either has occurred or it has not. So it is considered an event. But it gets tricky when it comes to labor trafficking or human trafficking in general. So in other words, do you need one incident that will qualify the entire case, or do you need repeated exposure? So in other words, we're talking about incident versus a state. Whereas human trafficking sort of leans itself conceptually towards modern slavery. But if you talk about slavery, it is really a state of existence, as opposed to an incident, crime. But when we talk about crime, as a criminologist myself, we usually think in terms of incidents. It either occurred or it doesn't occur. It hasn't occurred. And also, who gets to decide? There's so many stakeholders on this issue. Different audiences will have different thresholds. If you are the examiners working in Vermont looking at the TV's applications, you have a different set of thresholds because you're the one who decide whether this person gets a TV or not. But if you're a prosecutor, you have another set of the thresholds. And if you're an advocacy groups or researchers, you will have yet another set of thresholds to qualify what counts as the trafficking. So police, prosecutors, advocacy groups, researchers, and even self-reports by so-called victims have different versions of their stories and have different perspectives on what is or is not trafficking issue. Okay, so for the San Diego study, I went with the traditional chronological approach. Consider trafficking as an incident. So any single event, if it happened, it would qualify as a trafficking violation. So it's an incident-based screening tool as opposed to duration. So I didn't say how long have you been in this situation. So as if there's a qualifying. Well, if you go by the ILO definition of the modern day slavery, in the ILO definition, you would need to be in that state of existence for 1 year in order to qualify as a slave. So you see the definition issues really introduce a lot of complexities in the research world. In the traditional criminological research, there are three basic ways to get data. One is from police reports or official records, the records that you generate. And the second is talk to perpetrators, ask offenders, have you done the following things? And when did you do it the last time? How many times have you done it last year? Or you talk to the victims. Have you experienced any of the following violations? So my study was based on self-report of the victims. And in order to operationalize the TVPA, I decided to take a more conservative approach. In the TVPA, if you look at the definitions, they're essentially involving two things. One is probably abusive elements that involve something that's just not right. The other has more flavors in the intrusion or restrictions of the physical freedom or integrity of the physical integrity of the victims. So I decided to construct my instrument into two sectors. One part deals with any form of actual or threatened violations of the physical integrity. That involves assault, either physical or sexual assault, either actual or threatened, and also restriction or deprivations of the physical freedoms. In other words, you're not allowed to move, your workplace is locked, you cannot exit, and you're allowed not to communicate with people while you're doing your working hours. So there's some restrictions of a physical or communicative freedom at workplace. Then you have the next two categories involves fraud and deceptions, wage theft, workplace abandonment, unprotected clothing in terms of handling hazardous materials, and so on and so forth. These are considered fraudulent practices or just abusive labor practices. I throw those two into the two categories and use only the first two categories to count labor trafficking. So, and I used, again, back to the incident-based screening, I used incident. If it happened once, I will count. I don't care about how long or how many times you've been exposed. That, of course, also introduced the different layers of the problems in the counting scheme. Okay. Let's skip. My instrument aside, which is now also being used in North Carolina in a different study, there are two other agencies in the world who are also working very hard to develop instruments to measure these things called human trafficking. One is the Walk Free Foundation. It's an Australia-based foundation that just some wealthy people put a lot of money and want to study the modern-day slavery around the world. And the other is the International Labor Organization. The UN agency tries to standardize the measurements on human trafficking, both sex and the labor, and try to arrive at some common understanding so that researchers can use the same measurements, because this is what we consider the global phenomena. And to consider global phenomena, we need to have an instrument so that all of us can use, so we're generating statistics and data that can be compared. Okay, so where to find the victims? That's the problem. So trafficking victims are not evenly distributed. We know this. So if you have a social phenomena or you have a group of people whose location is highly skewed or concentrated into a specific pocket of the population, the conventional sampling strategy will not work. And for those of you who fill out census reports every 10 years or answer any phone calls on survey reports, most of these sampling strategies are probability-based. In other words, treating the population as a totality and randomly but systematically pick a sample out of that population. Like the American Community Survey that samples 50,000 households across the nation each year, asking a wide range of questions. And they have the General Social Survey. These, Census Bureau does these kind of surveys quite a bit, and it's always probability-based. But what if you have a population that is highly skewed? It's not evenly distributed. You know, like there's certain populations, like drug users, prostitutes, or jazz musicians for that matter, or gun collectors, or special antique collectors. These are the people are out there, and they are a social group, and they know one another. However, they are not evenly distributed. For instance, if you want to find jazz musicians, or antique collectors, or special gun collectors, you're not going to do a general social survey. Knock on every fifth doors on the street and ask you, when was the last time you collected certain guns or antique? That will defeat the purpose. You probably will find zero, because those populations are pockets in the population that are highly concentrated and skewed that defy the conventional sampling strategy. And these are what we call the hidden population. So what do they like? They're hidden, quote unquote. They're not really hidden, they're visible. In California, we have Home Depots. What do they have here in Texas? Lowe's. They're in front of Home Depots and agricultural field. And they are considered hidden because the conventional probability sampling will not capture them, even census. Census is supposed to count everybody in the population, regardless whether illegal or illegal in the country, by what? Going up to the doors, knock on the doors. First of all, send you waves of forms. Usually you fill it out. If you don't, they will start saying census workers go and knock on your doors. And usually Census Bureau says the attempts, you need to at least make 5 separate attempts to get that at that residence. These are the people the Census Bureau will miss. In my study, I found that more than 60%, close to 2/3 of my sample, lived in unconventional settings, in garages and makeshift shacks back in the back canyons, or bunk up in places that in apartments that, in different shifts, come and you sleep, because these are your hours, you come and sleep, and you go out and work, and the next week come and sleep. This is this population segment will routinely miss the census count. The Census Bureau will not be able to count this. That's what I mean by hidden population. They're not hidden in the sense that they cannot be located. They're hidden because they cannot be drawn through the traditional sampling strategy. Now, the strategy I use, a very short time frame, maybe I'll say half of that for the next presentation. The sampling strategy I use is called respondent-driven sampling. Essentially, what it relies on, chain referrals, like a snowball technique, but it's structured and incentivized. What it essentially does is that you start from random points in different parts of the population where you think you're likely to find that hidden population. Start with the seeds, then use this incentivized way, so restrict the number of people they can bring into the sample and also pay to have the conversation. This strategy is very important to avoid two problems. One is the size of the network. In other words, if I use the traditional snowball technique, I find someone, I talk to this individual, and this guy somehow is very popular, has a large network of friends, and ask them, can you refer me to other people who are like you to talk to us? And it eventually will wind up having a sample of that person's social network. So it is quite biased. And so in this strategy, we only allow 3 referrals, and we pay them, so we incentivize them, so that they don't pick the easiest person into the sample. And also we pay them to reduce what we call the voluntarism bias. In other words, people who volunteer to participate in your study are different from people who are not willing to participate. And we use money to incentivize that process, so to reduce, it's not that we can eliminate, but we can reduce this bias called voluntarism. And through this process, and as you make more referrals, you eventually are able to reach the edges of this so-called hidden population. And statisticians have run simulations and know and think after 2 or 3 waves, you should be able to reach the edges of the person's network. It's very important that this respondent-driven sampling has been used by public health people quite a bit to study people with the special kinds of diseases like HIV, among the IUD intravenous drug users, IDUs. So this is a strategy that's been used quite a bit by public health people, and in criminal justice, it's still not very common. So through this process, you're supposed to derive a representative sample. That's the bottom line. Whatever sample you use, you want to make sure that the sample you draw can produce the results and to project onto the population that you are studying. So that's the representativeness of the sampling strategy. And our study took place in the field for 77 weeks, and we used 16 different sites within San Diego County, and we used 7 bilingual interviewers, and we pay $30 for the interview, and each additional 3 coupons each. We're given 3 coupons, and each coupon is worth $10. So if they bring an additional person, they get additional $10, so they can make up to $60 for their participation in the study. And we planted 18 seeds, these original entry points. The other thing about with the snowball technique is that we always assume the entry point is biased. Because it's biased because these are the points developed by the researchers. However, as you make more referrals, the further away the referred people into the sample, the further away they are different, what we call the point of equilibrium, or the point of independence. So the additional waves coming to the sample will become independent of the entry point, regardless how biased the initial entry point is. So the eventual sample is 826. And this is a chart that reflects the field activities. And the problem with respondent-driven sampling is that it is a passive recruitment strategy. In other words, you give out the coupons, and you, with the contact information on the coupon, you wait for subjects to call in to be interviewed. It is not like knocking on the doors where you can become proactive. By increasing the field activities or by increasing the number of interviewers, you can rack up your sample size pretty quickly. This strategy, no. You give out the coupons, you wait for people to call. So it's a passive recruitment strategy. And it has drawbacks. And the drawbacks is the peaks and valleys you have to experience. And at the beginning, you plant seeds here, And look at week 3, 5, starting from week 3 on this, and shot up 51, 52. Our design sample size was 800. So when we were going through this, I thought, great, for once in my entire career, I get to finish my project on time. Or before, ahead of time. Then comes in this, zeros and zeros and zeros, zeros. 16 weeks in our study where there's absolutely no field activities. This is when you start panicking. You start dreading about your entire reputation is going down the drain. You're not going to finish the study. And by the way, this is not like contract work. I mean, I have staff on payroll. You pay them regardless whether their activities or not. So I was afraid that I would spend NIJ, the U.S. Department of Justice, money and not being able to deliver anything. That's when I started feeling maybe this is the wrong career I picked. So thank goodness, by dragging on, by asking for a 1-year extension, no-cost extension, I was able to finish the study. So I want to stop here and come back and tell you the findings. So more to come.